Welcome, everyone. I am honored and grateful to be able to introduce this virtual session on the costs of wildfire in California. We will start with a 20-minute presentation from our experts and then have a moderated discussion and Q&A. But first, by way of very brief background, in the spring of 2019, as a special project at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, we held a fire immediate response system workshop led by Chris Justice from the University of Maryland, and which convened a broad representation of other experts in remote sensing, AI, fire behavior modeling, emergency response, natural resource management, and other wildfire-related fields. The aim was to explore how existing or imaginable technologies could improve precision in early detection, assessment, and response for the small number of fires that escape control and risk becoming truly catastrophic events. To harness these technologies and get to a future where communities and ecosystems are resilient to wildfire, the group identified a handful of recommendations, including targeted investment in the development and adoption of new technologies, and improving our scientific understanding of these megafires, and also developing a cost-benefit analysis to weigh investment in these solutions that can seem pricey in terms of absolute value until you juxtapose them against the wildfire management costs we're seeing now. So for that, we turn to the California Council on Science and Technology, a nonpartisan nonprofit with a mission to provide scientific advice to the state of California. They've produced a report examining what considerations should be made to characterize the cost of wildfires in the state. And the CCST study team will present their high-level findings today. So we'll start with the executive summary presented by Mike Owara, Director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and Senior Research Scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. He is the chair of the steering committee for this study and will also be moderating the Q&A at the end. So with that, I will pass the presentation over to him.
Thank you, Jenny. The study on the cost of wildfire in California really benefited from participation by an outstanding steering committee, which you can see listed on this slide, composed of individuals from a variety of fields and with a variety of expertise touching on wildfire and with really deep experience in the area. We also really benefited from participation of Teresa and Sam Evans, our authors for the report, who just did incredible work to coalesce what is a very complex area of study into a comprehensible whole. Next slide, please. So today's wildfire context, in particular, the context of 2020, I think is really brought out by these two images. One is of the evacuation of Mammoth Pools by California National Guard during the early hours of the Creek Fire this summer. And I think it's fair to say that what we're experiencing in California and really throughout the Western United States is an unprecedented change in wildfire behavior and conditions that really began in California, perhaps in 2017 with the Napa-Sonoma fire siege and the Thomas fires, but has extended through the present. And we're encountering much larger fires. Fire intensity is higher than has been typical in the past. And the level of disruption and destruction is truly unprecedented. At the same time, moving to the image on the right, fire is producing truly statewide impacts in California, and probably most noticeably in terms of air quality. This is an image of air quality index from early September of 2020, recorded on low-cost sensors called purple air monitors. And what it shows is that wildfire in California is really becoming an issue that is not localized to the areas where fires occur, to the communities that burn, maybe communities that are adjacent and are impacted directly by fire. It's really a statewide issue, and we need to think about it as such. And that has implications for policymaking. It may mean that policies need to change. It may mean that greater investment is justified, but it is certainly the case that really everyone in California at this point is being touched by the problem of wildfire. And It's no longer limited to rural communities or communities in the wildland-urban interface. Next slide, please. So we were tasked with developing a comprehensive statewide calculation of wildfire costs. And our conclusion is that while it's not possible with currently available data to create a comprehensive statewide estimate, that we know a lot about impacts, and that while we can't specify a number with certainty, we can say some important things about it. In particular, that we believe with some confidence that the costs associated with some of the unquantified categories of wildfire losses, especially health impacts and the loss of ecosystem services after wildfires, are likely as big as the numbers that we know better, such as the cost of wildfire suppression or the cost of losses when insured real estate is destroyed in wildfires. So we believe that the costs are very large and that there are significant categories of costs that we're not measuring well, but that may be as large as the ones we are measuring well. Next slide, please. Another major conclusion of the steering committee is that wildfire regimes in the state of California are regional, and that different aspects of the problem, alteration, population growth, growth of the developed footprint, climate change, are affecting different regions in different ways and with different levels of intensity because of the overlay of these processes on regionally specific fire ecologies and climate patterns. So good wildfire policy at the state level needs to be comprehensive, needs to be statewide in its ambition and reach, but also needs to pay attention to regional context. Next slide, please. We concluded that certain aspects of the problem, as I mentioned, are well quantified and are substantial. It's possible to quantify with some confidence the costs of wildfire suppression, the cost of utility investments in avoiding ignition from wildfire, and the costs of insured structure losses. But there are many other costs where measurement is much more challenging, or where measurements are occurring, but they're not, measurements are not being made of cost in a way that allows for easy synthesis at the statewide level. We recommend that the state consider creation of a comprehensive public accounting of relevant programs in order to better understand, especially what the state is spending on wildfire mitigation, prescribed fire, for example, home hardening, creation of defensible space. The state should also consider thinking about research, funding research to evaluate cost effectiveness of these activities, and that this cost effectiveness research really needs to focus on ecosystem and natural resource values, as well as the easier to quantify structure values. The steering committee was quite concerned, and there's substantial research to support the idea that water supply and water quantity water supply and water quality may be impacted by wildfires in a significant way. Next slide, please. The steering committee also concluded that land use is a particularly important aspect of the wildfire problem, but that it's not well evaluated as a tool for reducing cost. And we recommended more research and more evaluation of land use planning and urban development as an alternative strategy to the other interventions that I mentioned to reducing wildfire losses. Next slide, please. A key takeaway from the report is that probably the most significant unquantified cost of wildfire at this point in California are the public health impacts caused by wildfire smoke. pulmonary and cardiovascular outcomes from particulate matter associated with smoke are a significant cause of morbidity and mortality in the state. And we need to systematically track these impacts if we want to have a hope of understanding the full cost of wildfire and therefore how much investment makes sense to mitigate the impacts. Next slide, please. So finally, we recommend creation of a comprehensive data clearinghouse for wildfire events and impacts related to smoke, prevention and mitigation, ecological impacts, and their associated costs. There are good models for creation of this sort of a clearinghouse in a California context. We thought CalEnviroScreen and the Open and Transparent Water Data Platform are good places to start for thinking about how to collect and synthesize all of the diverse sets of data that are relevant to the consideration of wildfire policy in the state. And we recommend that the state consider creation of such a clearinghouse so that we can know impacts and cost more clearly, so that we can evaluate the cost effectiveness of interventions, and so that we can develop better comprehensive wildfire policy for the state. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the study authors, Teresa Feo and Sam Evans, to present the chapter by chapter recommendations.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. So I'm going to go over the overall conceptual framework and scope of our report, talking about sort of what we included and some of the high-level results that we found with respect to wildfire losses. And then I'll turn it over to my co-author, Sam Evans, who will talk about the data that we found with respect to prevention and mitigation of wildfires. So here's a layout, a conceptual framework of the overall scope of our report. Wildfires are complex natural disturbances that cause many outcomes. And in response, society invests in prevention and mitigation to reduce those losses and increase the benefits. And so with our report focused on the cost of wildfires, we considered data sets that look at the dollar value estimates of the wildfire losses, as well as the costs of all prevention and mitigation actions that were undertaken in California in an effort to reduce those losses. And so for this report, we conducted a literature review to assess the availability of cost data. And we looked at the peer-reviewed scientific literature, as well as reports and other publicly available data sets. And this is basically a representation of what we found. Ideally, we would want to find, comprehensive statewide and systematic tracking of the losses, which would have been represented in yellow. Instead, we found that for some categories of cost data, we did find statewide tracking, but perhaps not comprehensive. And in other cases, in blue, we found data sets that report costs related to, say, individual fires or were individual studies. And maybe the methods varied between the studies, and so that it wasn't possible with the available data to add everything up together to come up with that comprehensive statewide estimate. And because of this is how we came to our first takeaway conclusion, which is that it's not possible to estimate the total cost with the currently available data. So I'm going to go over just some of the high-level results that we found with respect to data sets on wildfire losses. And having good comprehensive statewide data sets on wildfire losses and the costs associated with those losses are critical in order to conduct the cost effectiveness analyses that would help the state identify the most cost effective prevention mitigation strategies. And so having these good data sets help us get to that goal of better informed investments. So we looked at 4 categories of losses. First, we took a look at losses to the built environment, so buildings and physical infrastructure. And here we found, while we have pretty good data sets tracking the insured costs associated with these losses, as well as cleanup costs that are conducted by the state, after destruction or damage of physical assets. The biggest data gap here were costs associated with uninsured or underinsured physical assets, homes, buildings, and infrastructure and such. Next, we took a look at losses related to human health, and this is both, death and injury as a result of the physical wildfire, but also wildfire smoke and any post-wildfire events that may be triggered by the wildfire, such as landslides, water contamination, dust, etc. And here we found, while there's good statewide tracking of direct injuries and fatalities from the wildfire, many of the other ways that wildfires impact public health are not being systematically tracked. For example, the wildfire smoke, which does appear to be impacting the entire state in some circumstances. And for all of these public health impacts, we found no statewide tracking of the costs associated with these health impacts. Next, we took a look at ecosystem impacts from wildfires. And so this includes clean water, water yields in the state, carbon sequestration, air quality, biodiversity. And recently, the state of California has implemented a good effort to track systematically carbon sequestration rates within the state. And so good tracking of how wildfires impact the amount of carbon stored within the state. However, the costs associated with wildfires when it comes to ecosystems are largely unknown, and that's because we're actually missing an even more fundamental data set, which is just dollar values of ecosystem services in general. And then finally, we took a look at economic-wide impacts, sector impacts, impacts to labor markets, housing markets, etc. And here we found quite a bit of preliminary research showing that wildfires can have, both immediate and long-lasting impacts to economic activity. However, much more research is needed here to understand the underlying mechanisms of these observations and sort of the long-lasting impacts with respect to costs. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Sam now, who's going to talk about costs associated with prevention and mitigation.
Thanks, Teresa. So a second topic of costs that we reviewed are the costs associated with wildfire prevention and mitigation. Prevention and mitigation costs can be thought of as sort of the investments necessary to prevent or reduce the losses from wildfires that Teresa was just talking about. So the right balance of mitigation action requires understanding two sort of fundamental things: the costs of the different actions, and second, the effectiveness of the actions. So we try to lay out our current understanding of both of these dimensions across a broad range of mitigation and prevention actions. Next slide, please. So prevention refers to actions taken to prevent wildfire ignitions, and mitigation refers to actions taken to reduce the losses from wildfire outlined by Teresa, if indeed a wildfire does occur. So there are two broad categories of ignition prevention that we outlined in the report: public education programs to reduce human-caused wildfire ignitions, and industrial programs that prevent ignitions from utility equipment. Mitigation costs can accrue across a wide range of activities covering the built environment, the natural environment, social environment, and the response environment. The built environment refers to the features of buildings, roads, infrastructure, and other physical assets that influence wildfire losses. The natural environment refers to the fuels, weather, terrain, and other natural aspects of wildfire regimes that influence fire behavior. The primary area that we focused on in the report is the cost of various vegetation management strategies, such as fuel treatments and their effectiveness. The social environment refers to the cultural and behavioral components that impact fires, such as laws, policies, regulations, and those sort of things that guide land use planning and similar types of decisions. The response environment includes things that we're all more sort of familiar with, like wildfire suppression strategies, such as firefighting. Next slide, please. So some of the information on costs and effectiveness is well known and readily available. For example, here we see in the left graph the CAL FIRE suppression budget. And we see that CAL FIRE's expected to spend just over $3 billion this year on suppression activities. This is similar to what we see on the right graph, which shows total federal firefighting agency expenditures across the entire US in a given year, primarily between the US Forest Service and the Department of the Interior. Now, this includes all firefighting activities by these two agencies in the US, but a big part of this, of course, is spent in California. It's interesting to note that, while we do know that data, we actually don't know how much the federal government spends on fighting wildfires just in California. Other areas of mitigation and suppression expenditures are also well documented. For example, wildfire mitigation plans generated through a process overseen by the California Public Utilities Commission. They document utility investment in both prevention and mitigation. However, other areas of mitigation, we found that data and knowledge on effectiveness is incomplete, scattered across lots of different agencies or not easily accessible. For example, we know there are lots of fuel management projects throughout the state, but we couldn't find any easily accessible sort of centralized repository tracking the cost and the effectiveness of these fuel treatment activities. Other areas, such as expenditures on the built environment and the effectiveness of these actions, are much less comprehensively tracked and often occur outside of government budgets by private citizens, making them even more difficult to analyze. Next slide, please. So having this information on costs and effectiveness of prevention and mitigation activities is essential for effective policy making and planning. However, despite these gaps, it is apparent that investment in prevention and non-suppression mitigation actions are well below the state's suppression expenditures. Better tracking and analysis of mitigation efforts would lead to a rebalancing of prevention, mitigation, and suppression activities that may improve the state's capacity to reduce losses from catastrophic wildfires. One possibility would be to set target ratios for mitigation and suppression spending, similar to what FEMA does for post-disaster spending. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate a few broad takeaways from our report. It's important to stress that an incredible amount of research and effort to track and understand the costs of wildfires in the state has taken place. So while we don't know everything or the total costs, for some categories with at least partial statewide estimates, shown here in green, we do know that costs are in the billions to tens of billions of dollars per year. And for the other categories where we have some data but lack statewide estimates, those are shown in blue here, we can confidently conclude that many of these unquantified costs are likely to exceed billions of dollars. So the main takeaway we want to leave folks with is that the next time you see a dollar value estimate of the cost of a wildfire, and you think to yourself, wow, that's a really big number, take a moment to ask what was included in that estimate, because it's likely that the losses left out of the calculation for lack of good data would more than double the reported costs. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Michael Wera.
Thanks very much, Sam and Teresa. And now we're going to take questions from the audience.